Welcome to the Unseen Whispers, where the stories linger long after the night fades. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because some stories feel different in the dead of night. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1. The Black-Eyed Farmers. Emma Thompson's heart pounded as the old family sedan crept up the gravel path leading to their new home. The sun had long since set, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light over the sprawling, seemingly endless fields of corn that surrounded the farmhouse. The Thompson family had left behind the familiar noise and chaos of the city for a quieter, simpler life, or so they thought. "Emma, help your mother with the bags," her father Samuel called out from the front door as he unloaded boxes from the car. His voice was rough, tired, but still trying to keep some semblance of cheerfulness for the sake of the family. Emma nodded, pushing the unease deep inside her. Her gaze shifted to the shadows stretching across the yard, dark shapes forming and dissolving in the corners of her eyes. She could have sworn she saw something move in the distance. Perhaps it was just the wind. As Emma stepped out of the car, she heard a faint sound, the rustling of dry corn stalks in the fields. The air smelled of earth, of dust, and something else she couldn't quite identify. It was the smell of history. It was the smell of something forgotten. Her brother Jake was already inside the house, setting up their makeshift living room. Their mother Marianne was unpacking kitchenware, humming softly. Emma glanced around once more, catching a glimpse of an old, decrepit barn in the distance. It seemed abandoned, though not in a way that felt right. It had an air of something lurking inside, waiting to emerge. "Come inside, honey," Marianne called, waving a dish towel. "You don't want to stand out there too long." Emma followed her mother into the house, the heavy door creaking shut behind her. The inside was cold, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. A few dim lamps lit the space, but something about the house, its two high ceilings and long, narrow windows, made it feel both empty and too full at once. The silence was deafening. No birds chirped outside, no sounds of city life, just the wind. "I don't like it here," Emma muttered to herself as she put down her bag in the hallway. Marianne smiled softly, though there was a forced quality to it. "It's just new, sweetheart. Give it time. You'll see. It's going to be a great change for us." Emma wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, Emma's unease grew. The town of Blackwell was small, far smaller than she had imagined. Only a handful of houses lined the main street, and it seemed that most of the people who lived there were somehow connected to the farm life. Emma spent the days walking around the property, her feet crunching in the dry cornfields. Each time she passed the barn, it seemed to loom larger, its windows black like eyes that watched her. But the most unsettling part of the town were its people, the farmers. At first, they had been kind, offering advice and tips on how to grow crops and raise livestock. But Emma noticed something strange about their eyes. They were black, completely, utterly black. The first time she saw it, she thought it was some sort of trick of the light. Maybe they had been working too long under the sun, but it wasn't just one person. It was all of them. Her father Samuel seemed not to notice. He was too absorbed in getting the farm running, too distracted with repairs and planting. But Emma couldn't stop staring at the dark, empty pits where their eyes should be. It was like they were seeing something she couldn't. "Are you sure you're okay?" Emma asked her father one evening as they worked together to mend the fence that separated their land from the rest of the farm. "I'm fine, Emma," he said absent-mindedly, his eyes never meeting hers. "Just tired. We'll get it done, don't worry." It was then that Emma realized something truly terrifying. Her father's eyes were darker too. She hadn't noticed it before, but they were slowly changing. Maybe it was just the shadow of the evening sun, but she didn't think so. The more Emma thought about it, the more she felt there was something wrong with this place. Something far older and far darker than she could have imagined. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees and the moon hung low in the sky, she made her decision. She would investigate the house's history. The next day, while Jake was busy with the farm and her parents were off to the local store, Emma ventured into the town library, an old, dusty building that had seen better days. The library was quiet, the air thick with the smell of mildew and old paper. She dug through old town records and newspaper clippings, hoping to find something that might explain the strange behavior of the farmers. She found it in a yellowed book, a collection of local legends. Isaac Blackwell. The name jumped off the page, as though the ink itself had been infused with malice. Isaac Blackwell, the original owner of their farm. He was a man who had lived over a century ago, during a time when the land had been cursed. According to the book, Blackwell had made a pact with a dark force, an ancient entity that dwelled beneath the earth. The pact was made in exchange for prosperity and success, but Blackwell had not known the true cost. The force, which called itself the Shadow in the Fields, would claim the souls of those who worked the land. It would take their bodies as vessels, using them to do its bidding. The people of Blackwell were no longer truly human. They were merely empty vessels, cursed to serve the Shadow for eternity. Emma's heart raced as she read. The farmers she had seen, the ones with the black eyes, were not just infected with some kind of disease. They were possessed, their bodies being used by the Shadow to carry out its will. And the more Emma thought about it, the more she realized her family was in danger. They were next. The next few days passed in a blur, with Emma feeling more and more isolated. Her father had become withdrawn, his presence almost oppressive. Her mother had started to behave strangely too. At dinner, Marianne barely spoke, her face pale and hollow. Her voice, when she did speak, had an eerie, distant quality. But it was Jake who changed the most. Emma first noticed the shift when he began to wake up in the middle of the night, muttering under his breath in a language Emma couldn't understand. His eyes, too, were darkening. He stopped making eye contact with her altogether, and whenever Emma asked him questions, he answered with short, cryptic responses. One night, Emma woke to find Jake standing in the middle of their bedroom, staring blankly at the wall. His eyes were entirely black. Emma could feel a chill run down her spine as she quietly approached him. "Jake," she whispered, but there was no response. He just stood there, unmoving. Emma knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act before it was too late. She spent the next few days researching everything she could find on Isaac Blackwell and the cursed land. It wasn't until she dug deeper into Blackwell's personal history that she uncovered something horrifying. A relic, a dark stone tablet that had been used to summon the shadow. It had been hidden somewhere on the farm, but no one knew where. Emma couldn't be sure of the relic's exact location, but she had a feeling that finding it was the key to breaking the curse. That night, Emma snuck out of the house, determined to find the relic before the entity could claim her family. The wind howled as she ventured into the field, the corn bending unnaturally in the gusts. The barn loomed in front of her, its doors cracked open as though inviting her inside. With trembling hands, she entered. The air inside was thick and musty, as though it hadn't been touched in years. She scanned the room, her flashlight trembling as she searched for the relic. And then, in the far corner of the barn, she saw it, the stone tablet. It was etched with symbols she didn't understand, but Emma could feel its power radiating from it. Her pulse quickened as she approached. She knew this was her last chance to save her family. But as she reached for the relic, something moved behind her. A shadow, tall and foreboding, rising from the dark corners of the barn. Emma spun around, her heart racing. The shadow in the fields was no longer just a distant fear. It was here. Its presence filled the air, suffocating and cold. Its eyes were endless voids, drawing in all light, all hope. It reached out, its tendrils of darkness swirling toward Emma. In that moment, Emma knew what she had to do. The curse could only be broken by a sacrifice, her sacrifice. She raised the stone tablet high, the symbols glowing faintly in the dark, and brought it crashing down onto the ground. The barn shook violently, and the shadow let out a horrible scream. The entity was vanquished, but Emma's soul was lost forever. The town of Blackwell would never forget the legend of the black-eyed farmers. The town once again fell silent. And though the evil had been vanquished, the land itself remained cursed, forever haunted by the lingering shadows of those who had served the shadow in the fields. The sun was setting on the quiet, forgotten town of Redstone, Wyoming, casting long shadows across the dirt roads and barren storefronts. Jackson Moore had been driving for hours, his car's headlights cutting through the night as he approached the heart of the town. This wasn't his first assignment, but it was the one he had been dreading most. The small town was known for being isolated, tucked into the mountains, and having a strange history that didn't sit well with him. But every small town had its secrets, didn't it? Jackson, freshly appointed as the new sheriff of Redstone, was hoping for a fresh start, even if he wasn't sure exactly why the position had come his way. His old job as a deputy in a larger town had ended under less than ideal circumstances, and this was his second chance. At least that's what he told himself. As Jackson drove past the town's rusted welcome sign, he could see the lights of the sheriff's office flickering in the distance. The station looked older than most buildings in town, with peeling paint and a crooked sign hanging from a rusted chain. The small town had little need for a sheriff, and he was sure that this would be just another mundane job to occupy his time, at least until he started asking questions. Jackson parked his car outside the station and stepped out, the chill of the evening air hitting his face like a slap. A light breeze stirred the leaves of the few trees lining the street. He had read the town's history before accepting the job. Redstone was founded in the mid-1800s and had a history of mining and trade, but in the last century, Its prosperity had waned. Despite that, there had always been one constant: the sheriff's office. The sheriff was always there, always a presence. But the oddest thing, Jackson thought, was the disappearance of the sheriff every year. According to the local records, the sheriff would vanish for weeks each year and then return, older, more haggard, and with a look in their eyes that said everything had changed. He had brushed off the rumors at first, but now that he was here, it felt different. The town felt off. As Jackson walked toward the office, he noticed something strange. There was no sign of life. Not a single person on the streets, not even a car. It was as though the town had emptied out, leaving behind a hollow, suffocating silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. It was dimly lit, the smell of old leather and cigarette smoke lingering in the stale air. Behind the desk sat a man who looked up as Jackson entered. He had the weary look of someone who had been living in this small town far too long. His clothes were disheveled, his face rough with days-old stubble. His eyes, however, stood out. There was a sadness in them that Jackson couldn't quite place. "Sheriff Holden?" Jackson asked, extending his hand. The man didn't stand. Instead, he just gave a slight nod and grunted. "You're the new guy, Jackson Moore, right?" Jackson nodded, trying to read the man's expression. He didn't seem all that friendly, but he also didn't seem hostile, just tired. "Yeah, that's me. I guess we're going to be working together." Sheriff Holden sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Listen, Moore, I don't know what they told you, but this place, it's different. There's a tradition here, something you won't find anywhere else. You'll see soon enough." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "What kind of tradition?" "Just get ready," Holden said, his voice low. "You'll understand soon enough." Before Jackson could ask another question, the door to the office opened and a tall man stepped in. His face was pale, his clothes ragged, and his eyes were the darkest brown Jackson had ever seen. The man nodded in Jackson's direction, but didn't say anything. He was wearing an old sheriff's badge, Holden's badge, in fact. "That's Deputy Randall," Holden said, finally standing and offering Jackson a drink. "He's been with me for a long time. He knows what's going on around here." Jackson turned to the deputy. "What's going on exactly?" Randall's eyes flickered to Holden before he spoke. "Just watch yourself. Don't dig too deep. Trust me, you don't want to know what happens if you do." Before Jackson could ask any further questions, Holden interrupted. "Look, I've got work to do. You're here for a reason. Get settled in. Things will start to make sense soon enough." With that, the two men turned and walked out, leaving Jackson standing alone in the dimly lit sheriff's office. His gut was telling him something wasn't right, but he couldn't place it yet. All he knew was that he had to find out what was going on, and fast. The next morning, Jackson walked through town with a sense of quiet unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in Redstone was watching him. People walked by in silence, barely glancing at him. He tried to make small talk with a few locals, but they all had the same detached, distant demeanor. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to explain anything. But as the morning wore on, Jackson began to notice something even stranger. The sheriff's office was locked up tight. The lights were off, and there was no sign of Holden or Deputy Randall. The more he looked around, the more he realized that this was no ordinary disappearance. Something was very wrong in Redstone. As Jackson walked past the old diner, he caught sight of a man huddled in the corner booth, watching him. The man's eyes were wide, filled with fear and desperation. Jackson approached him. "You know something, don't you?" Jackson asked. The man looked over his shoulder nervously before speaking. "You don't know what you're asking, officer. Stay out of it. Just let things be." Jackson's mind raced. "What's going on? What's happening to the sheriff?" The man leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Every year, it's the same thing. The sheriff disappears. It's a tradition, but no one talks about it. Not really. You'll see soon enough, and when you do, it'll be too late." Before Jackson could respond, the man slid out of the booth and bolted out of the diner. Jackson stood there, frozen. This wasn't just some small-town quirk. This was something much darker. That afternoon, Jackson decided to dig deeper. He spent hours at the library, going through old town records, newspaper articles, and anything else he could find. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the town's history became. The sheriff's disappearance was a long-standing tradition, going back more than a century, with only one consistent thread. Each time, the sheriff would return weeks later, but aged, worn, and forever changed. The pattern was clear. Every year the sheriff was sacrificed, and the town remained prosperous, its economy stable, its people quiet, and its problems non-existent. The sheriff, in his old age, would then choose a new deputy, the next sheriff to take his place. It was a grim, unspoken ritual that was both a blessing and a curse. Jackson felt a growing sense of dread. This was no coincidence. The sheriff's disappearance, the strange looks from the townsfolk, the cryptic warnings, it all pointed to the same thing. But what was behind it? What was the force controlling Redstone? What did the sheriff become after he returned? Jackson had to find out before it was too late. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him. The more he asked, the more the townspeople shut him out. They went about their business like nothing was wrong, but Jackson could see the fear in their eyes. They knew something he didn't, and that knowledge was eating at them from the inside out. It wasn't until Jackson visited the old church at the edge of town that he began to piece things together. The church was locked, but a small hole in the back of the building revealed a hidden passage. He squeezed through the narrow opening and found himself in an underground chamber, a chamber that seemed far older than anything above ground. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar. Surrounding it were carvings, intricate, disturbing symbols that made Jackson's skin crawl. The air was thick with the scent of incense and decay, and that's when he saw it. Beneath the altar, a massive crack in the earth revealed a gaping hole. From the depths below, a low rumbling sound emanated, and something ancient and powerful stirred. Jackson backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. This was no ordinary god. It was something older, something that had been here long before the town had been built. It fed on the sheriff's sacrifices. The sheriff was never truly missing. He was being offered up to the god beneath Redstone every year in exchange for prosperity. And now Jackson realized the god was growing restless. The sheriff was never truly free. He was a vessel for an ancient evil that would never let him go. Jackson's mind raced. He had to break the cycle. But how? How could he stop something this old, this powerful? The days passed, and Jackson grew more and more desperate. He tried to warn the townspeople, but they only grew more frightened. The town's mayor, a stout woman named Clara, finally approached Jackson with a chilling warning. "You don't understand," Clara said, her voice trembling. "The sheriff isn't just a person. He's a protector, a conduit. We need him. Without him, Redstone will fall into ruin. You can't stop this. It's the only way." But Jackson couldn't accept that. He had to find a way to end the cycle, to stop the bloodshed. He returned to the church, determined to face whatever lay beneath. As he descended into the chamber once more, he knew what he had to do. He had to make the ultimate sacrifice, to seal the god away once and for all. With the altar before him, Jackson made his choice. He knew what he had to do. The god beneath Redstone had grown too strong, and there was only one way to stop it: to sacrifice himself, to take the sheriff's place. But as Jackson placed his hand on the stone, the god's power surged, and his vision blurred. The god's voice echoed in his mind, ancient and powerful, promising him a future of unimaginable power, of eternal life. In the end, Jackson chose to sacrifice himself, sealing the god away beneath the earth for another 100 years. But the cycle would never truly end. As the days passed, the town of Redstone continued as though nothing had changed. The sheriff's office was once again bustling, the town streets filled with life. But beneath it all, a new sheriff walked the earth. Jackson Moore's face was now one with the god that had claimed Redstone. As Jackson wandered through Redstone in the days that followed his unsettling discovery beneath the church, a sense of dread gnawed at him. There was something in the air, something about the town's slow, rhythmic heartbeat. The days stretched on in their eerie stillness, and Jackson's isolation grew as he felt like an outsider trying to make sense of an unspoken truth. The townsfolk went about their lives pretending that nothing was wrong. They went to church, they worked the fields, they laughed with one another, but there was always the undercurrent of fear. He had hoped that confronting the truth would offer him a sense of clarity, a way to stop the endless cycle, but instead, he only felt more trapped. The deeper he dug into the town's history, the more he realized just how deep the roots of the cycle went. Every year the sheriff was offered as a sacrifice to an ancient god that lay beneath the town, and every year the god demanded its due. The sheriff returned, changed, and the town continued to thrive. But at what cost? Jackson couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to this cycle, something far darker than he had anticipated. He kept seeing faces from his past in the faces of the people of Redstone. Figures he thought had been long gone, figures who were once deputies, sheriffs, and even friends. They all looked as though they had been here for far longer than he could have imagined. That night, as he sat in the empty sheriff's office, poring over old records, a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. What if the sheriff's disappearance wasn't the only part of the ritual? The god beneath Redstone didn't just demand a physical sacrifice. It required the sheriff's essence, his very soul, to renew the god's strength. Jackson's hands trembled as he realized that every sheriff who had gone before him had been replaced by an older version of themselves, a version that had been bound to the god's power, aging unnaturally, each return a hollow shell of the person who had once stood in the office. He could feel the dark weight of this truth pressing down on him, suffocating him. His phone buzzed, shaking him from his thoughts. It was a message from Deputy Randall. "You need to leave. Get out before it's too late. They're already preparing for you." The urgency of Randall's message hit Jackson like a tidal wave. He had been warned, but the depth of the truth hadn't yet fully registered in his mind. Now, with no time to lose, Jackson raced out of the office, heading toward the outskirts of town, where the church stood perched on the hills overlooking Redstone. He wasn't sure where he was going, but there was a sense of destiny pulling him forward, an instinct that told him the time to act was now. As Jackson approached the church, he saw figures moving within the windows. Shadowy figures. They were preparing, just like they had for years before, ready to enact the ritual. The quiet, peaceful exterior of the town now felt like a mask, hiding the darkness that simmered beneath it. He had to stop them. He couldn't let himself become a part of the cycle, not when he had the power to change things. Jackson entered the church with his gun drawn, the cold metal a poor substitute for the dread that filled his chest. The air inside was thick with incense, and the dim light of candles cast long, flickering shadows across the stone walls. The altar, now familiar to him, loomed like a silent witness to countless sacrifices. There, standing before the altar, was Sheriff Holden, though the man before him was not the man Jackson had once met. Holden's face had aged further, his skin pale and leathery, his eyes hollowed out. The transformation was almost complete. Jackson's stomach twisted as he realized the truth. Holden had already been claimed, his soul consumed, and now the god's power rested within him. "Why?" Jackson choked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you stop this?" Holden slowly turned, a grim smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "You think this town's prosperity comes from hard work? Number it comes from the god beneath the earth. And every year we give a sheriff to keep it that way. It's always been this way. It always will be. The cycle must continue, Jackson. And you're the one who'll keep it alive." Jackson's heart raced. "No, I won't." Too late. Holden's smile widened. "You've already been chosen." Before Jackson could react, the ground beneath him rumbled, the walls of the church vibrating with the power of the god's presence. Jackson stumbled back, a deep, guttural voice filling his mind. It was as though the god spoke directly to his soul, offering him power beyond imagination, a life that stretched on forever, filled with knowledge and supremacy. It was tempting, so tempting, but Jackson resisted, clutching his head as the whispers became louder, more insistent. "No, I won't become like you," he yelled. The ground split open beneath him, and Jackson fell to his knees. The altar began to glow, and the earth around it trembled. From the depths below, something vast and ancient stirred. He could feel the weight of the god's presence rising, its hunger insatiable. It was then that Jackson realized what he had to do. There was no escaping the god's grasp. There was no breaking the cycle without a sacrifice. But it wouldn't be him who was consumed. He wouldn't allow this ancient evil to continue. He had to end it, no matter the cost. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jackson pushed himself toward the altar. He grabbed the sheriff's badge, still hanging from Holden's chest, and yanked it free. The moment the badge left Holden's body, a violent tremor ripped through the church. The altar cracked wide open, and from the abyss beneath, a hand emerged, dark, twisted, and massive, reaching for Jackson. Jackson had no more time to hesitate. He lunged forward, slamming the badge onto the altar and shouting a final defiant cry. The moment the metal touched the stone, a blinding light engulfed the room, and the earth shook with an unearthly roar. But it wasn't over. The god's power surged violently, threatening to swallow the entire town. Jackson screamed as the light tore through him, his body racked with pain. He felt his own soul being torn from his body as the god's power sought to claim him. He knew that this was the only way. He had to become the new vessel, the one to contain the god's power and seal it away. As Jackson's body was consumed by the light, he could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him. He was no longer just Jackson Moore. He was the sheriff. He was the god's vessel. The god would live, but it would be trapped, sealed in his soul for eternity. When the light finally faded, the earth stilled, and the air became heavy with silence. The church was still standing, its walls scarred by the ritual. Jackson's body lay on the altar, lifeless, but not truly gone. The god beneath Redstone had been contained, sealed in the form of the new sheriff. Jackson had become part of the cycle, just like all the others before him. As the town began to stir, people emerged from their homes, unaware of the horror that had transpired beneath their feet. They saw a figure emerge from the church, a figure who looked like Jackson, but wasn't quite the same. The sheriff was back. The cycle would continue, and with that, Redstone's dark tradition would carry on. Jackson stood at the church door, his eyes black, his face a mask of ancient power. The people of Redstone cheered, unaware of the price that had been paid to ensure their town's survival. They greeted the new sheriff as if he were an old friend, not knowing that he was now part of something far darker than any of them could imagine. Jackson Moore had become the new vessel. The god beneath Redstone had been sealed away for now, but the cycle would continue. Every sheriff who took the job would be bound to the god's will, and every year the ritual would repeat itself. No one would ever know the truth, except for the one who was chosen. The god was patient. It always was, and the cycle would never end. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains when Thomas Harrow entered Black Hollow. The small town lay nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness, its winding roads and hidden paths making it nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where you were going. Thomas had heard the town was quiet, perfect for someone like him, someone who had grown tired of the chaos and clamor of city life. His car's headlights cut through the growing darkness as he maneuvered along the craggy roads. The trees closed in around him, their branches reaching like bony fingers over the road. He felt an odd sense of anticipation, a weight that seemed to settle in his chest the closer he got to the town. As he passed the sign welcoming him to Black Hollow, the words felt wrong. The lettering was chipped, and the paint had peeled away over time. But it wasn't the sign that unnerved him. It was the dead silence that greeted him. No birds chirped, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. He shook off the unease as he drove down the main street of the town. The buildings were old, almost abandoned looking, but it was clear that people still lived here. Few windows were lit up, and no one was on the streets. The town felt like a relic from a different time. Thomas turned into a gravel driveway and parked in front of the Black Hollow Inn, a small, weather-beaten structure that looked like it had been around for centuries. It was the only place to stay in town, and the elderly woman who ran it had seemed nice enough when he called to reserve a room earlier. As he stepped out of the car, the air grew colder, and the wind carried an odd, high-pitched sound, like a distant whistle. He frowned, trying to place it, but the sound faded quickly. Inside, the inn smelled of old wood and musty air, a heavy presence of time and history hanging in the atmosphere. The woman behind the counter greeted him with a nod, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. Her eyes seemed to linger on him too long, as if she already knew him, as if she was weighing him in some way. "Thomas Harrow, right?" she asked, her voice gravelly. "Yes, that's me. A room for the night?" Her lips twitched. "We've been expecting you. Room 3 upstairs. But remember, you're here for the peace, not the noise." "The noise?" he asked, tilting his head. Her eyes flickered toward the door for a moment, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Don't worry about it. You'll hear it soon enough." Thomas tossed his duffel bag onto the bed and stretched, glad to finally be away from the long drive. He looked out the window at the thick forest surrounding the town. The sun had set completely, and the only light came from the faint flicker of street lamps in the distance. As he sank into the bed, exhausted, he closed his eyes. The hum of the night seemed to surround him, but it wasn't a peaceful hum. There was something off about the air tonight. He could feel it in his bones, something restless, something waiting, and then he heard it, the whistle. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. A high, mournful note carried on the wind, then another and another. The whistle seemed to travel with the breeze, winding its way through the town like a ghostly call. Thomas sat up, frowning. He looked toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But there was nothing, only the darkness of the trees and the empty streets. The sound persisted, unsettling and strange. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders and lay back down, but the whistling didn't stop. It continued, rising in pitch, echoing through the town. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his jacket, slipped into his shoes, and headed outside, following the sound. The air had turned even colder, and the woods surrounding the town seemed to loom darker, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers. The wind had picked up, carrying the whistle further into the night. It was almost as though the sound was calling him, drawing him deeper into the forest. Thomas walked slowly, each step careful and deliberate. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their shadows heavy and foreboding. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy above, casting everything in a ghostly gray haze. The whistle grew louder as he pushed forward. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was an entity. It tugged at his mind, gnawed at his thoughts, its cadence a rhythmic pull that seemed to seep into his bones. And then he saw it. A small cabin, barely visible through the dense fog that had begun to settle around him. It stood isolated, abandoned, its wooden walls sagging under years of neglect. The door creaked in the wind, but there was something inviting about it. Something that seemed to pull Thomas in. As if in a trance, he stepped forward, reaching for the door handle. The door to the cabin opened with a low groan, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. The air inside was thick with dust, the silence oppressive. The only sound was the faint echo of the whistle outside. But inside the cabin, something else was present, something old. In the center of the room, on a small wooden table, lay an antique music box. Its surface was intricately carved, its brass handle shining dully in the dim light. Thomas couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to it. He picked it up, his fingers grazing the cold metal, and as he did, the whistle grew louder as though in response. The music box's delicate lid opened slowly, and a haunting, familiar melody began to play. It was soft at first, a sweet, almost innocent tune, but as it continued, the melody twisted, distorted. The whistle blended with the music, creating an eerie harmony that reverberated in his skull. The room seemed to close in around him, and his vision blurred. The air felt thick with energy, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive. Shadows flickered along the edges of the room, and suddenly he saw a figure, pale and gaunt, standing at the edge of his vision. His heart raced. It was the figure from the visions, the whistler. His mouth moved, but no sound came from his lips. His eyes were hollow, lifeless. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward Thomas. The whistle grew louder, maddening, filling his ears until he could think of nothing else. The room spun, and he staggered backward, clutching the music box in his hands. "No," he whispered, but the whistle drowned out his voice. He collapsed to his knees, the music box falling from his hands, the whistle now a deafening roar in his ears. His head throbbed with pain as images of the past rushed at him, the ghost's tortured existence, his wrongful death, the vengeance he'd sworn upon Black Hollow, and then it all went black. When Thomas woke, he was back in his room at the inn, drenched in sweat. The whistle had stopped, but the silence was even more oppressive now. His head felt like it was going to explode, and the weight of the vision still lingered in his mind. He stumbled out of bed and looked out the window. The town looked the same, but something was wrong. The trees in the distance seemed to whisper to him, their branches swaying even though there was no wind. The whistling had stopped for now, but the silence felt worse, like it was holding its breath, waiting. He could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on him as he walked into the inn's dining room. They were watching, their faces tense, their eyes filled with something unreadable. "You heard it, didn't you?" the elderly woman asked, her voice softer now, almost pitying. "The whistle," Thomas said, his throat dry. "What is it?" She looked at him long and hard before responding, her voice almost a whisper. "The whistler's ghost. It's been here for centuries, tormenting the town. The whistle marks those who will lose their sanity, or worse. You've been cursed, Thomas." "What do you mean, cursed?" he asked, his heart racing. "He was a man once, unjustly accused, driven mad by the townsfolk. They killed him, but his ghost, his whistle, it's a curse. Anyone who hears it is marked for madness. But I didn't ask for this," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "Doesn't matter," she replied. "Once you hear the whistle, you're part of it. You can't escape." Thomas couldn't escape the sound. It followed him, twisted his mind, became a part of him. He spent days wandering the streets, the woods, searching for answers, but the whistle never stopped. It consumed him. The music box haunted him, its melody playing in his mind even when he wasn't near it. The visions of the whistler, The ghostly figure pointing at him grew more vivid, more real. The town seemed to close in on him, the people watching him with pity in their eyes. They had all heard the whistle. They had all succumbed, and soon so would he. Days blurred into one another. Thomas had become a shadow of his former self. He barely ate, barely slept, and when he did, the nightmares of the whistler's ghost haunted his dreams. Visions of a pale skeletal figure standing in the woods, waiting, always waiting. The whistle never stopped, a shrill piercing sound that gnawed at his sanity. He couldn't escape it. It echoed through every street of Black Hollow, into every building, and now it seemed to haunt him wherever he went. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear it, curling in his ears like a whisper, a promise of what was to come. One evening, as Thomas wandered the streets in a daze, he saw a group of townsfolk gathered near the center of town. They looked as if they were talking in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders. Their faces, normally expressionless, were now filled with dread. A man, one Thomas had seen a few times at the inn, stepped forward, noticing him standing near the edge of the crowd. His eyes were wide, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words low, almost urgent. "The curse, it's happening to you too. You've heard it, haven't you? The whistle?" Thomas nodded, his throat dry. I don't know what's happening to me. It's like I can't escape it. The sound, it's always with me." The man took a step closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You're marked, like all the others. It always starts the same way. You hear the whistle and then it starts to change you. It warps your mind. It twists your soul." The words felt like they were suffocating him. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his voice raw. "The ghost. He was once a man. They accused him of something he didn't do. They drove him mad with their lies, and in his final moments, he swore vengeance on the town. Now, every year the whistle comes, and those who hear it are chosen. You can't run from it. No one can." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. "And the music box? What does it have to do with all of this?" The man's eyes darkened. "The music box is the key. It's the only way to break the curse, but it won't save you. It never has. You've already heard the whistle. You're part of it now." The words seemed to sink into Thomas's chest like lead. "How do you know all of this?" The man paused for a long moment before answering, his voice thick with guilt. "Because I heard it too. I thought I could fight it, thought I could escape, but we're all trapped here, this town. We're all cursed." Thomas stepped back, feeling the weight of the man's words press down on him. There was no escape, not from the sound, not from the town, not from the ghost. The following days felt like they existed in some sort of limbo. Thomas had lost track of time. The whistler's curse seemed to intensify with each passing hour, and the townsfolk's warnings had become more frequent, more urgent. He spent his nights wandering the streets and the woods, searching for answers that never came. The whistler's song echoed through his thoughts, pulling him toward the very thing he dreaded most. The town itself was beginning to warp under the weight of the curse. The once quiet streets were now filled with a strange tension, eyes constantly watching, whispered conversations cut short when he passed by. The few townsfolk he could manage to speak with seemed distant, detached, as though they were resigned to their fate, as though they had long since given up hope of ever escaping. Thomas had tried to speak to the elderly woman at the inn, but every time he approached her, she would avoid his gaze and change the subject. It was clear that no one wanted to talk about the Whistler's ghost. No one wanted to admit that they were trapped in this nightmare. One night, Thomas ventured deeper into the woods, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the town anymore. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches clawing at the sky. The whistle sounded again, sharper, more distinct than ever before. It was as if the very woods themselves were alive, bending and twisting with the sound. And then he saw it, just like before, the figure of the Whistler standing in the distance, his outline faint but unmistakable. His eyes glowed with a hollow emptiness, his lips parted in a twisted smile, his finger pointed directly at Thomas. The Whistler's ghost was waiting for him. The music box appeared before him, appearing from nowhere, its twisted melody swirling around his mind. He tried to move, to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The whistle grew louder, the music more frantic, until it was all he could hear, all he could feel. "Help me," he gasped, his voice breaking. The ghost tilted his head slightly, as though considering the plea. And then, with a flicker of movement, the Whistler began to whistle again, the sound sharp and biting. The trees seemed to tremble, and the earth beneath Thomas's feet seemed to shift, as if the very ground was alive and listening. Thomas's mind was spiraling. He couldn't tell where reality ended and the curse began. The music box's tune looped in his ears, pulling him deeper into madness. He felt his grip on reality weakening with every note, every breath. But then something shifted within him. A strange clarity pierced through the fog of his thoughts. He could feel the music box's power, its influence on the curse. It was more than just a tool. It was a gateway, a way to bind the Whistler, to trap him once again. Thomas knew, deep down, that he had to destroy the box. But in doing so, he would be sacrificing himself to break the cycle. He would never be free. The ghost would claim him, but it would stop the Whistler from claiming the town again. It was the only way. With trembling hands, Thomas lifted the music box. The whistle echoed louder, more insistent now. He could feel the presence of the ghost standing behind him, waiting for him to make his move. He pulled the box apart, piece by piece, the sound of splintering wood mixing with the whistle's shrill cry. And then, in a final burst of desperation, he threw the box into the air and watched it shatter, its pieces scattering into the night. For a moment, everything was silent. The whistle stopped. The ghost faded into nothingness. But Thomas felt something shift within him. His body felt lighter, but his mind, it felt like it was unraveling. The moment the curse had been broken, he realized it wasn't just the town that had been freed. It was him. The Whistler had claimed him. He was now the vessel for the ghost's spirit, bound forever to the cursed town. In the days that followed, the townspeople of Black Hollow returned to their lives as though nothing had changed. They went about their business with the quiet knowledge that they were safe for now. But they never spoke of the Whistler, and no one spoke of Thomas Harrow. Some say that from time to time, late at night, a whistle can be heard on the wind, carrying through the trees. Those who hear it know the Whistler has returned, and the curse continues. And somewhere deep in the woods, the ghost waits, waiting for the next soul to answer his call. Isaac Granger, a seasoned oil rig supervisor, had seen his fair share of strange occurrences during his career, but nothing prepared him for what he would face at Blackwater Rig. Situated in the Mississippi River, the rig stood like a forgotten monument to industry and ambition. The air around the rig was heavy, thick with humidity, and a strange stillness settled on the water, as if the river itself was holding its breath. As Isaac boarded the rig for his first shift, the crew greeted him with nods and polite murmurs. Most were hardened workers, accustomed to the dangers of oil extraction, but there was something different in the air tonight, an unsettling energy that seemed to linger over the rig like a storm cloud, threatening to break. He had heard rumors about Blackwater Rig before, how some people believed it was cursed, how workers spoke in hushed tones about the strange disappearances and accidents that seemed to happen every year. But Isaac dismissed these stories as mere superstition. After all, oil rigs were dangerous places, and things went wrong in the most unexpected ways. But as the rig loomed over the river, Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He tried to focus on the task at hand, going over the crew's schedules and maintenance logs, trying to push the gnawing sense of unease from his mind. That night, as he made his rounds, he noticed the first strange thing, a deep hum that seemed to resonate from the water below. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, vibrating in the pit of his stomach. He frowned and walked to the edge of the rig to peer over into the black waters, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. "Isaac, you okay?" a voice interrupted. It was Jared, the lead engineer, his brow furrowed in concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Isaac shook his head. "I'm fine, just a weird feeling." Jared didn't seem convinced. "Well, you're not the only one. People around here are getting jittery. Some of the crew won't even go out on deck at night anymore." Isaac frowned. "You think it's just nerves?" Jared hesitated before answering. "Maybe, but there's something about this place. I don't know. I've been hearing things, whistles, at night, low, like a distant tune carried by the wind." Isaac scoffed. "You're letting the old-timers get to you. Ghost stories aren't going to help us finish this job." Jared didn't respond immediately, but his eyes darted toward the water again. "Maybe, but just keep an eye out. It's not just the guys who are jumpy. It's the whole damn rig." Isaac nodded reluctantly. As he continued his rounds, he couldn't help but wonder if there was something to Jared's concerns. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had a job to do. The next morning, the rig was bustling with activity as usual. But by midday, something was wrong. The atmosphere had changed. Crew members were walking around with nervous glances, their conversations hushed. When Isaac asked one of the workers what was going on, the response was immediate. "Tom's missing." Tom was one of the rig's most experienced drillers, a reliable man who had been with the company for years. It was out of character for him to disappear without a word. Isaac tried to stay calm, brushing off the concern as a simple misunderstanding. "He probably went down to the supply room or something. I'll check it out." But when Isaac made his way to Tom's room, it was empty. No sign of the man anywhere. The door was unlocked, his belongings untouched. Isaac's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. He headed straight to the control room to check the surveillance footage, but there was nothing. The cameras on the lower decks were static. The crew had reported Tom missing 6 hours ago, but the last recorded footage was from the night before, showing him walking along the lower deck with no indication of trouble. Isaac's gut tightened. He knew something was off now, but he had no idea how deep the trouble ran. The workers were rattled. Some claimed they had seen something moving beneath the water. Others spoke of hearing strange noises at night, like whispers carried on the wind. But no one could explain what happened to Tom. As night fell, the hum from the river grew louder. Isaac stood at the edge of the rig, staring down into the water. The moonlight shimmered across the surface, but beneath that placid exterior, something dark and ancient stirred. The days that followed were filled with escalating fear. More crew members reported odd occurrences, doors opening on their own, machinery malfunctioning without explanation, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. But the most terrifying thing was the sound, the whistling. It started faintly, almost like a melody on the wind, but as the days passed, it grew louder and more distinct. The workers who heard it began to show signs of mental strain, nervous tics, paranoia, and insomnia. Some of them claimed they could hear whispers, voices beckoning them into the water, promising them peace if they would only surrender. Isaac was no exception. He began to hear the whistling too. It was like a haunting tune that seemed to call to him, beckoning him to the edge of the rig. He couldn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the rig was alive in some way, and that it was drawing him closer to something. One night, Isaac was on watch when the whistling reached its crescendo. The sound was maddening, piercing through the silence of the night, louder and clearer than ever before. He could feel it in his bones. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing on the lower deck, just beyond the reach of the lights. It was hunched, its body twisted in an unnatural way, and it was whistling, no, singing, in a low, eerie tone. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the figure was unmistakable. Isaac's heart raced as he approached, his hand reaching for his radio. But before he could speak, the figure vanished into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. He was left standing alone in the night, his mind racing. The whistling continued, a constant, maddening reminder of the presence that lurked just beyond the rig. Determined to uncover the truth, Isaac began his own investigation. He started by asking the oldest members of the crew about the rig's history. What he uncovered was something far darker than he ever could have imagined. Blackwater Rig had been built on land that had once been sacred to an ancient civilization, one that had ruled the Mississippi River long before the arrival of settlers. The crew members spoke of old stories, of whispers that had been passed down for generations. They spoke of a curse, of an ancient force that had been awakened by the construction of the rig. They spoke of the Whistler, a spirit of vengeance who had once been a man, but who had become something much more. As Isaac dug deeper, he began to uncover evidence of strange rituals, sacrifices, offerings to the water, all designed to appease whatever ancient god lay beneath the river's depths. But it was too late. The god had already been disturbed. The creatures beneath the water were waking. Driven by a primal need for vengeance, they had begun to hunt the workers on the rig, claiming their lives one by one. Isaac's search led him to the rig's lower levels, where he discovered a hidden room, a forgotten chamber filled with old carvings and symbols. In the center of the room, a stone altar lay in disrepair, and above it, a massive stone carving of a monstrous aquatic creature. The carvings told a story of a civilization long lost, an ancient race that had once ruled the waters of the Mississippi. The creatures were their gods, and they had been worshipped for centuries. But the gods had been disturbed, awakened by the drilling operations of the rig, and now they were angry. As the creature's presence grew stronger, the rig descended into madness. The crew members began to crack under the pressure, unable to handle the constant terror. Some began to jump into the water, drawn by the whispers and the promise of peace. Others went completely mad, screaming and lashing out at their fellow workers. Isaac knew that they had only one chance to survive. He had to destroy the rig, destroy the very thing that had awakened the creatures. In a final desperate act, Isaac triggered the rig's self-destruct sequence. He had to sacrifice everything, even his own life, to stop the creatures from rising again. As the rig erupted in a massive explosion, Isaac could hear the creatures retreating back into the depths. But he knew that this was only a temporary victory. The creatures were still there, still waiting, and one day they would rise again. The survivors of Blackwater Rig were few, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed. Isaac Granger was never found. Some say he perished in the explosion. Others claim he was taken by the creatures, lost to the waters forever. But one thing was certain. The horrors of Blackwater Rig would never be forgotten. The creatures below the river were still there, waiting, and they would rise again. Elena Walker's hands trembled as she stared at the glowing screen of her phone. The number flashing on it was one she hadn't expected to see again. Her father's. She swallowed hard, a lump rising in her throat. It had been weeks since their last conversation, a conversation that ended abruptly. She had tried to push it from her mind, the things left unsaid between them. Yet now this late-night call from him felt like an omen, like the universe was pulling her back to something she wasn't ready to confront. It had been years since her father had been anything other than a mystery. He was a quiet man, introverted, never eager to share details of his life or past. His job, his whereabouts, his relationships, all shrouded in secrecy. Growing up in his home, Elena had become accustomed to the shadows in the corners of his life, the ones he seemed to drag with him. It was unsettling, but she never questioned it. Now, standing in her apartment, staring at the phone, she felt something stirring inside her, an ancient primal feeling of dread. The missed call had come just minutes ago. Elena stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the redial button. Should she call him back? The call had come from his apartment, she realized as she checked the number. He hadn't been at home for days, his apartment abandoned. She had only assumed it was a temporary absence, maybe a trip he hadn't told her about. But something in the pit of her stomach told her that this time, something was different. Her father was gone. Elena arrived at her father's apartment with a heavy heart and even heavier steps. She had rented a car for the drive, the cold Chicago wind battering against her face as she stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The building itself was old, one of those forgotten relics of the city's past, filled with peeling paint and a pervasive scent of mildew. It looked as though it had never truly been alive, only existing in the dim shadows of time. The elevator groaned as it carried her up to the 5th floor. Elena's thoughts were swirling, half fearing that she would find nothing, just the remnants of a life left behind. The other half of her wondered if she was about to uncover something far darker, a truth about her father she wasn't. But as she reached for the door to leave, something caught her eye. A photo album, half hidden beneath a pile of papers on the coffee table. Hesitant but driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Elena flipped it open. The first page was a picture of her father from his younger years. Only it wasn't him. It was a doll. The face was unnervingly similar to her father's, but disturbingly not quite human. As she flipped through the album, the same face appeared, but the doll's form changed over time. It had evolved. Her heart sank as she realized the unthinkable truth. The following hours were a blur. Elena called the police, but they found nothing unusual, no signs of foul play. Her father's death was deemed natural, but Elena knew in her gut that something was horribly wrong. She couldn't shake the unsettling images of the dolls. She couldn't escape the feeling that the answers to her father's death lay hidden in those unsettling, lifelike eyes. She was desperate for answers. She returned to the apartment the next day, now fully aware of the horrors that lay within. She rifled through her father's belongings again, determined to find anything that could explain what she had seen. It was in his study that she uncovered a hidden drawer filled with strange, cryptic notes and sketches of dolls, and something more disturbing. The name written on one of the pages stopped her dead in her tracks. Alaric Sable, the name of a man she had never heard before, but one who seemed to have been deeply involved in her father's life. His sketches were detailed, meticulous, representations of lifelike dolls, but also something more, rituals, incantations, and symbols of an occult nature. Each sketch seemed to show the transformation of the doll into something more human, more alive. The journal's pages spoke of experiments, of bringing life to inanimate objects, of transcending death itself. The deeper she dug, the more she discovered about Alaric Sable, a reclusive craftsman once renowned for his extraordinary talent in creating lifelike dolls. But there were rumors about him, whispers that he had dabbled in darker arts, that his creations weren't just dolls but vessels for the souls of the dead. And Elena realized with mounting horror that her father wasn't human at all. He had been one of Sable's creations, a doll brought to life through an occult ritual, abandoned by Sable and allowed to live as a human for years, unaware of his true nature. But if he was a doll, what was he? What had he become? And why had he died? What had happened to break the spell, to end his years of living as a human? Elena spent the next few days obsessively poring over the contents of her father's study, trying to make sense of the strange documents and cryptic drawings that seemed to lead back to the enigmatic figure of Alaric Sable. She couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her father had been connected to something far darker than she could understand, something that involved far more than just dolls. As the hours slipped by, her once familiar world was fading into something alien, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The more she read, the more she realized that Sable's obsession with immortality had consumed him. His diary entries spoke of creating the perfect vessel for life, a doll so lifelike that it could be brought to life through an unholy ritual. A ritual that involved infusing the doll with human traits, emotions, and memories, Sable had succeeded, too successfully it seemed. Her father had been his greatest creation. Elena couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her father once he had been alive. Had he known the truth? Had he been living in ignorance, blissfully unaware of his origins? Or had he always known he was different? The fact that she had never heard him speak about his past, about where he came from, who he truly was, suddenly felt like a grave warning. Was it possible that he had hidden it from her all along? The dolls, Elena thought, staring at the photo album. They weren't just random creations. Each one was a piece of something much larger. They were part of a ritual that had somehow been interrupted with her father's death. With this revelation in mind, Elena decided to track down Alaric Sable. It took hours of searching, cross-referencing the name in old archives, and digging through obscure forums and underground circles. Finally, she found something, a thread buried deep within a forum dedicated to occult practitioners. It spoke of Sable's disappearance. There had been rumors that he had gone into hiding after an experiment gone wrong. Some claimed he had died in a fire. Others insisted he had simply vanished, taking all of his secrets with him. But one post, buried in a forgotten thread, caught her eye. The doll maker's final experiment. The dolls are coming. Elena's pulse quickened. There was more to this story than she had realized. The experiment wasn't just about creating dolls. It was about immortality. But what did that mean for her father, and more importantly, for her? The dolls weren't just lifeless figurines. They were alive, and they were closing in on her. That night, Elena lay in her father's bed, trying to shut out the creeping terror that gnawed at her every thought. She could hear the hum again, faint but unmistakable, as though the apartment itself was breathing. The dolls seemed to be everywhere, their glassy eyes following her movements, their porcelain faces twisted into expressions that almost seemed alive. Suddenly, a noise broke through the silence, a soft scraping sound from the living room. Her heart leapt in her chest as she slowly rose from the bed, her steps muffled against the cold floorboards. She crept down the hallway toward the source of the noise. When she reached the living room, the sight before her made her blood run cold. One of the dolls, the smallest one, which had sat on the far shelf earlier, was standing in the middle of the room. Its head turned slowly with an unnatural creak until its eyes met hers. Elena stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The doll's expression was eerily familiar, as though it were mimicking her father's face. She hadn't moved it, she was certain of that. And yet, here it was, standing, its joints creaking as though it had somehow become more than an object. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as though it had a mind of its own, the doll blinked. Her stomach twisted in horror. The dolls weren't just watching her, they were coming to life. Elena's hand instinctively reached for her phone, but before she could call anyone, a loud crash echoed from behind her. Spinning around, she saw the others, dozens of them, beginning to move. The dolls were shifting, sliding down from the shelves, pulling themselves off the furniture, as though they were all waking up. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the first doll reached her, its cold porcelain fingers brushing her ankle. She screamed, kicking it away, but it only stood up again, its eyes fixed on her, unblinking, unmoving. "What do you want?" Elena gasped. her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The room seemed to hum louder now, vibrating with energy. The dolls, each with its grotesque, lifelike features, seemed to encircle her, their heads slowly tilting in unison. Then, just as quickly as they had moved, they stopped, freezing again, their expressions unmoving. Elena's mind raced. What had happened? What was going on? She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. But then, like a whisper from the shadows, a voice cracked through her thoughts. "You are the key." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they echoed through her mind, sending a chill through her spine. Suddenly, everything clicked. The ritual, the dolls, her father, Alaric Sable's twisted experiment. She was the key, the last piece of the puzzle that could complete the dollmaker's final creation. The next morning, Elena did the only thing she could think to do. She returned to the mansion that had once belonged to Alaric Sable. It was the only place left where she might find the answers she so desperately needed. A place where she might uncover the final truth of the dolls and the legacy they carried. The mansion stood in the outskirts of Chicago, a sprawling, decrepit structure hidden behind overgrown trees and twisted vines. It was as though time had forgotten the house entirely, the windows boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Elena stepped inside, her heart pounding, her hands slick with sweat. The air was heavy with dust and decay, the smell of rot lingering in the walls. As she made her way deeper into the mansion, the rooms seemed to stretch out endlessly, filled with half-finished dolls, forgotten experiments, and strange ancient symbols carved into the walls. And then, in the heart of the mansion, she found it. A large ceremonial chamber, dark and foreboding, surrounded by eerie, lifelike mannequins positioned in strange poses. In the center of the room was a strange pedestal, and on it, a doll. But this doll was different. Its features were not like the others. It was a grotesque imitation of a human. Fingers too long, skin too smooth, its eyes too wide. The moment Elena stepped closer, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. The doll moved. "It's almost complete, Elena." The voice, dark and hollow, came from somewhere in the shadows. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned around. Standing before her was Alaric Sable, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and decayed, his skin barely clinging to his bones, yet his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were very much alive. "You've come to finish the experiment, haven't you?" Sable rasped, his voice an eerie blend of glee and malice. "Your father was the first, but you will be the last." The chamber surrounding Elena felt alive. The walls seemed to close in on her as the figure of Alaric Sable took shape in the shadows, his decaying body an unnerving reminder of what had happened to him. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the doll in the center of the room, its unnaturally human features staring back at her with lifeless but almost accusing eyes. Sable's voice broke through her paralysis, a rasping sound that seemed to vibrate within her very soul. "You were always meant to be part of this, Elena. Your father wasn't the end, he was only the beginning." Elena's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. Her father hadn't been human. He had been a doll, a living, breathing creation of Sable's dark art. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin, and her body instinctively wanted to flee. But there was no escaping now. She was trapped in Sable's domain, in the heart of his madness. What did you do to my father? She demanded, her voice trembling but determined. What have you done to me? Sable's face twisted into something that almost resembled a smile, though it was more of a sneer, the skin around his mouth taut with years of decay. Your father was the prototype, the first successful experiment. He took a step forward, and the room seemed to grow colder with each movement. But you, Elena, you're different. Her pulse raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Different? How? What do you mean? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned her with a look of eerie satisfaction, as though he were inspecting a prized creation. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and cold, the weight of his words sinking into Elena's chest like lead. You are the key to completing my greatest experiment, Elena. You are the final piece of the puzzle. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The final piece? Her legs wobbled beneath her, and for a moment she thought she might fall. But she held her ground, her mind racing for an explanation. What are you talking about? She spat, her voice defiant despite the fear clawing at her throat. Sable's decayed hands lifted, and he motioned to the doll on the pedestal. This doll, Elena, is no ordinary creation. It is the vessel for true immortality, a perfect human body, crafted from the finest materials imbued with the souls of the dead. And you, he said, leaning in closer, his breath rancid and damp against her skin. You are the bloodline that will complete it. Her mind reeled. Souls of the dead? Immortality? Sable wasn't just creating lifelike dolls. He was trying to create a being that could live forever. And the key to completing this dark ritual was her. A sick realization washed over Elena. Her father, a doll. Her, his daughter. Perhaps born of that ritual, or at least a necessary component of it. The dolls that had followed her, the ones that seemed to come to life, they were all fragments of something bigger. No, Elena whispered, her voice breaking. She staggered backward, the weight of his words suffocating her. I won't let you do this. Sable's eyes glittered with a dark amusement. You don't have a choice. Suddenly, the air grew heavy with a low, vibrating hum. Elena's blood turned to ice as the dolls in the room began to move, their porcelain joints creaking and snapping into place, their lifeless eyes locked onto her. She could hear them now, the whispers, just beyond the threshold of hearing, as if the dolls were speaking among themselves. The doll in the center of the room, the one that resembled a grotesque version of a human body, began to move. It twitched, slowly at first, then jerking violently as though something was trying to awaken inside of it. The cracks in its porcelain skin began to widen, and Elena could see the faintest glow of light emanating from within, like the flicker of a dying flame. The ritual is already in motion, Elena. You can't stop it now. Sable's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it sent a ripple of dread through her entire being. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The dolls were surrounding her, their glassy eyes fixated on her every movement. But there had to be a way to stop this. She couldn't let herself become a part of this experiment, couldn't let Sable's twisted vision of immortality become reality. But there was something else, something she hadn't fully understood until now. The dolls weren't just tools in this dark ritual. They were alive in their own twisted way. They carried the fragments of souls, pieces of whatever dark magic Sable had bound to them, and they were calling to her. Suddenly, Elena realized the truth. She had to break the cycle. In that moment, Elena understood what had to be done. She had been searching for a way to stop the ritual, but the answer had been in front of her the entire time. These dolls, these abominations, were more than just vessels for souls. They were trapped, just as her father had been, and they were all looking to her to free them, to put an end to Sable's cursed legacy. The doll in the center of the room twitched violently, and Elena could see it, the soul trapped inside it, struggling to break free. It wasn't just a lifeless object. It was a living, conscious being, bound to the doll maker's will. She realized with growing horror that all of the dolls in the room were once humans, once people who had been used by Sable to fuel his sick experiments. They had become the dolls. Her father had been one of them, a living, breathing doll, but he had been abandoned, left to live out his life as a human, unaware of his true nature. Now, she was the only one who could stop the cycle, to put an end to the nightmare once and for all. "I will destroy you, Sable," Elena said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "I will stop this." Sable's laugh was dark, cruel. "You think you can stop what's already begun?" He sneered. "You can't. The dolls have already chosen you. You are part of this, whether you accept it or not." As if on cue, the dolls began to move again, slowly circling her. Their cold, lifeless eyes filled with something darker now, something alive. They weren't attacking her. They were trying to wake her up. Elena felt the pull, the dark magic that had been bound to her since birth. She was the final piece, and yet she would not let herself become part of this twisted legacy. With a scream, Elena charged toward the pedestal, grabbing the first object she could find, an old ceremonial knife that lay forgotten beside the doll. With all the strength she could muster, she plunged it into the base of the doll's neck. The room exploded with energy. A shockwave of dark magic pulsed through the chamber, the dolls screaming as the energy tore at them. Sable's eyes widened in disbelief as the ritual broke apart, the force of Elena's action shattering the hold he had on the dolls. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Then the dolls froze. Their bodies, once so lifelike, crumbled into lifeless heaps of porcelain and dust. The room went silent, and in that silence, Elena understood that she had done it. She had broken the spell. With the ritual broken and Sable's power undone, Elena stood in the ruined heart of the dollmaker's mansion. The remnants of the dolls lay scattered around her, their once perfect features now shattered and broken. Sable, who had once been a man of unimaginable power, was now nothing more than a husk. His decayed body crumpled and lifeless on the floor. The last vestiges of his magic had evaporated with the ritual's end, but Elena felt no triumph. Instead, she felt empty, as though the weight of the truth had crushed her. She had lost so much, her father, the life she had known, and though she had broken the cycle, she knew there would be no returning to the world she had once known. She was the last living witness to the dollmaker's dark legacy, the final piece of his experiment. But she had made her choice. She would live on, not as a doll, not as a part of his twisted legacy, but as a woman who had fought against the darkness. As she walked away from the ruins of the mansion, the wind whispered behind her, carrying with it the faintest echoes of the dolls she had freed. They were no longer watching. They were finally free.